It was the only reason I wanted to do the last season, to be able to do this.
MASH was...
Alan Alda sat nestled in a cozy armchair, the kind that seemed to hug you back, in a quiet corner of a New York studio. At 89, his eyes still held the same mischievous sparkle that had endeared him to millions as Hawkeye Pierce. But now, there was something deeper in his gaze, a weight shaped by decades of stories, laughter, and a few hard truths. As the camera rolled, capturing the soft creases of his face, he leaned forward, ready to share something long held close. It wasn't exactly a secret, but rather a lesser-known piece of the MASH * legacy, one that fans had only whispered about, a behind-the-scenes clash with a co-star that sent ripples through the show long after the final episode aired. The story began in 1972, when MASH * was just a scrappy new series trying to find its footing on CBS. Alan, 36 at the time and already a seasoned Broadway actor, stepped into the role of Hawkeye, a wisecracking surgeon stationed in a Korean War field hospital. The part demanded a delicate balance of humor and heart, like walking a tightrope. The set was a storm of talent, egos, and the high-stakes pressure of creating something groundbreaking. Everyone knew they were part of something special, but that didn't make it easy. Alan still remembered the first time he met Gary Berghoff, the actor who brought Radar O'Reilly to life. Gary was just 29, with a nervous energy that made him perfect for the role of the wide-eyed company clerk who always seemed to know what was coming. On screen, Radar was the heart of the 4077th, the lovable kid in over his head. Off-screen, however, things were less harmonious. Alan noticed early on that Gary kept to himself between takes, his intensity creating a quiet distance. At first, Alan assumed it was method acting. After all, Radar was always a bit on edge. But as the seasons wore on, it became clear Gary was wrestling with something deeper. The first signs came subtly. Gary would snap during rehearsals, not at anyone directly, but at the noise, the chaos, the improvisation that Alan and the others thrived on. Alan loved spontaneity, it gave MASH * its spark. But Gary needed structure, a script to anchor him. One day, during a scene in the swamp, Hawkeye's tent, Alan ad-libbed a line, joking that Radar's teddy bear was a spy for the North Koreans. The crew laughed, the take landed, but Gary's face tensed. Later, in the mess tent, he pulled Alan aside. "You can't just change things like that," he said, his voice low but firm. "It throws me off." Alan nodded, trying to smooth it over. He wasn't trying to upstage anyone, just following what felt true to the character. But the moment stuck with him. It was the first time he realized Gary wasn't just particular, he was struggling. Alan tried to bridge the gap, inviting Gary to join the cast for drinks after long shooting days. But Gary often declined, heading back to Connecticut to be with his family. What Alan didn't know then was how much Gary was juggling, cross-country commutes, a young daughter, and a marriage under strain. All Alan saw was a co-star pulling away, and it frustrated him. He missed the camaraderie he had with Wayne Rogers or McLean Stevenson, the kind where you could rib each other and laugh afterward. By season 4, the tension had become hard to ignore. MASH * was a hit, but success came with its own pressure. Gary's performances remained stellar, he even won an Emmy in 1977, but behind the scenes, he was fraying. Alan remembered a day on the Fox lot while filming Abyssinia, Henry, the episode where Colonel Blake dies. The script was a gut punch, and emotions ran high. Gary, though, was unraveling. He wasn't just acting, he was falling apart. After the director called cut, Alan watched Gary walk off alone, wiping his eyes. Alan followed, thinking he might offer a kind word, but Gary waved him off. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice cracked. Alan didn't push, but he wished he had. The real confrontation came in season 6, during the filming of Fallen Idol, an episode where Radar feels let down by Hawkeye. The script called for Hawkeye to lash out, a rare display of cruelty. Alan dove into the scene, letting Hawkeye's frustration boil over. But when the camera stopped, Gary didn't break character. "Why do you always have to make it about you?" he said, louder than usual. The set went still. Alan was stunned. He'd thought they were on the same page, but but Gary felt overshadowed, like Hawkeye's spotlight was eclipsing Radar's story. Alan tried to explain it was in the script, not personal, but Gary walked away, leaving a silence that hung heavy. Alan never held a grudge. He understood Gary was under pressure, maybe more than any of them, but it still hurt. MASH * was like a family, messy, flawed, but tight-knit. Gary's distance felt like a quiet betrayal. In the wake of their rift, Alan poured himself into writing and directing, partly to preserve the soul of the show, partly to cope. He penned Dear Sigmund, one of his favorite episodes, where Hawkeye's humor masks deeper pain. For Alan, it was a form of therapy, a way to process the complicated web of connection, both on screen and off. When Gary eventually left the show, citing burnout and a need to be with his family, Alan respected his decision. But part of him always wondered if their tension had played a role. Their farewell was polite, a handshake, a few words of good luck, but the warmth was missing. Alan watched him go, feeling a mix of sadness and something harder to name, regret. Gary's final episode, Goodbye, Radar, was a bittersweet moment for Alan Alda. Watching Gary deliver such a raw, vulnerable performance filled him with pride, but also a lingering sense of regret. Gary had been brilliant, no question. But Alan couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere along the way, they'd missed an opportunity to truly connect. The show ended, life moved on, and MASH * became legend. Alan kept busy, films, Broadway, his podcast Clear Plus Vivid. But Gary's name continued to surface, whether in fan letters or interview questions. Was there bad blood? People would ask. Alan always brushed it off, saying the set was intense for everyone. But now, at 89, sitting in a quiet New York studio, Alan felt ready to tell the truth, not for gossip's sake, but to finally make sense of it all. Speaking to the camera like it was an old friend, he said gently, Gary and I didn't hate each other. We were just different. I wanted to play, to explore. He needed control, stability. Neither of us was wrong, but we didn't know how to meet in the middle. He leaned back in his chair, resting his hands on the armrests, and let his mind drift to the last time he'd seen Gary, at a MASH * reunion in the 90s. They'd hugged, shared a few laughs, remembered old times. But something remained between them. Not animosity, just a wall. Thin, but real. Alan hadn't brought up the past that day. There didn't seem to be a point. As the studio lights dimmed and Alan stood to stretch his legs, he didn't feel the need to say more. The story he'd told wasn't about blame. It was about two people doing their best in the chaotic, beautiful mess of making something that mattered. Fans would watch, speculate, argue online. But Alan felt lighter. He'd spoken his truth, not to settle scores, but to honor what they had all built together, even when it wasn't easy. Walking out into the crisp New York evening, his scarf loose around his neck, Alan let the city's quiet hum surround him. Still, his thoughts were far away, back in 1972, on the dusty MASH * set in Malibu, where the early tension with Gary Berghoff had first taken root. He didn't dwell on regrets often. Life was too short for that. But at his age, he found himself stitching together memories like a quilt, looking for the pattern that made sense of it all. The story of his and Gary's friction wasn't about one moment or one bad day. It was woven through the show's fabric, the intensity, the joy, the strain of making something that reshaped television. The MASH * set was its own world. The air carried the scent of stage blood and sweat, the sound stage buzzed with both camaraderie and creative tension. Alan thrived in that space. His Broadway instincts kicked in, letting him bounce off co-stars like a jazz player riffing in a smoky club. He'd toss out a quip, Loretta Swit would volley back, and the scene would spark to life. Most of the cast thrived on that spontaneity. Wayne Rogers could match Alan line for line. Larry Linville, as Frank Burns, made a perfect comic foil. But Gary was different. Radar wasn't built for improved. Gary's performances were precise, every stammer and gesture mapped with care. Alan remembered filming an episode in season 3 called The Nurses. It was lighter, meant to balance the show's heavier moments. During one take, Alan playfully ad-libbed a line, asking if Radar's teddy bear had written a note. The crew laughed, even Loretta cracked a smile. But Gary froze. He'd lost his rhythm. Later, in the makeup trailer, Alan overheard Gary muttering about sticking to the script. It wasn't loud, but there was a bite to it. At the time, Alan shrugged it off. He thought Gary was just being particular. Maybe a little inexperienced. But now, he saw it differently. Gary wasn't just protecting a character. He was guarding himself. Radar wasn't just a role, it was Gary's identity. Every word, every beat had to land just right because, in a way, Radar was his lifeline. And Alan, with his casual charm and improvisational style, had unknowingly shaken that foundation. That unspoken tension followed them into Season 4, just as MASH * found its voice. The show took risks, black and white episodes like The Interview, or darker, more introspective scripts. Alan was in his element, writing and directing, shaping Hawkeye into the show's beating heart. Gary, meanwhile, became quieter. Radar's scenes still shone, but Gary's energy shifted. He often skipped cast dinners, choosing instead to call home or return to Connecticut. Once, Alan tried joking with him about Radar stealing extra Jell-O from the mess tent. Gary smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Gotta keep him real," he said softly, then walked away. Alan didn't press. He had his own battles, scripts to rewrite, his marriage to tend to, the burden of being the show's de facto leader. Still, he wished he'd asked what Gary meant by real. Was it Radar's innocence? Gary's pride? Something else? The not knowing gnawed at him. The cracks widened in Season 6. The episode Fallen Idol, where Hawkeye cruelly snaps at Radar, blurred too closely with reality. Alan played it raw, leaning into Hawkeye's flaws. But Gary took it personally. After a heated exchange on set, he barely spoke to Alan for days. The crew noticed, but no one addressed it. The machine of the show kept grinding forward. When Gary announced his departure in 1979, Alan wasn't surprised. The official reason was family. Gary's daughter needed him, and the cross-country commute had worn him down. Alan believed that. But he also wondered if the tension on set had tipped the scales. Gary's final days were a strange mix of emotion and formality. The two-part goodbye, Radar tore at the heartstrings. On screen, Gary was masterful. Off-screen, he was distant. Alan wanted to say something, an apology, a goodbye that meant something more. But the moment passed. A quick hug. A polite take care. And Gary was gone. The years flew by. MASH * ran for more seasons, securing its place in history. Alan found new paths, directing, writing, hosting. Gary, meanwhile, faded from the spotlight. He appeared here and there, but never quite found another role like Radar. Alan heard stories, a divorce, health issues, a quiet life in Connecticut. Fans kept the MASH * flame alive, always asking about the good old days. What was Gary like, they'd ask. Alan would smile, praise his talent, sidestep the rest. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. Now, reflecting in the calm of his apartment, coffee in hand, Alan let the past wash over him. He didn't have clear answers. The rift with Gary was a small thread in the tapestry of a life full of noise and color, but it mattered. It taught him something about empathy, about recognizing the quiet struggles others carry. MASH * wasn't just about war. It was about people, flawed, funny, human.